Sierra Leone, August 25th, 2000. 12 men in 3 Land Rovers are heading home from a routine liaison call, kicking up red dust on a road that links Masiaka to the coast. Their mission is done, a visit to Jordanian peacekeepers attached to the UN, a shared meal, a handshake, back to base. The patrol belongs to 1st Battalion, the Royal Irish Regiment, part of a British training team that had replaced an outgoing unit just weeks earlier in July. Nobody in those vehicles expects anything unusual about the return journey. Over lunch at the Jordanian base, someone passes intelligence to the patrol commander, Major Alan Marshall. The Westside Boys, a militia operating in the bush east of Freetown, are reportedly beginning to disarm. Marshall makes a decision. Take a short detour toward the village of Magbeni to investigate on the way back. That route isn't on any authorized list, and the Westside Boys aren't disarming. The track into Magbeni is narrow, overhung with vegetation. As the vehicles approach, a Bedford truck blocks the road. Mounted on the back is an anti-aircraft gun. Armed men emerge from the tree line on both sides. Marshall dismounts, resists an attempt to grab his rifle, and is beaten to the ground. Within minutes, all 12 men are at gunpoint. They are herded to the bank of Rockall Creek, forced into canoes, and paddled across to a village on the far bank. Geri Barna, pronounced Geberi Barna, the Westside Boys' headquarters. 6 British soldiers and 1 Sierra Leonean army officer will spend the next 16 days there. 16 days is a long time when the men guarding you carry weapons and don't respond predictably to anything. The hostages were held in a hut. The heat in the Ochra Hills in late August is sustained and penetrating. This is a country near the equator in the wet season, and Geri Barna is jungle, not coast. There was little food, inadequate water, and no medical care for whatever injuries the men had sustained during capture. The guards rotated, but the guns didn't disappear. The compound smelled of vegetation and rot, and the sounds of the camp, shouting, occasional gunfire into the air, music, carried through the walls of the hut at all hours. The hostages were beaten. They were subjected to mock executions. Fode Calais, the Westside Boys' leader, at one point lined them up and demanded to know why they had entered his territory, threatening to shoot them if he didn't believe the answer. Whether any given moment of intimidation was designed or impulsive was impossible to determine from inside the hut. That uncertainty was its own form of pressure. Lieutenant Musa Bangura received a different treatment entirely. The Sierra Leonean Army liaison officer who had served as the patrol's interpreter was separated from the British soldiers and placed in a pit that the Westside Boys used as a latrine. He was beaten throughout his captivity, starved, isolated from anyone who could tell him whether he would survive. He spent those 16 days in filth, unable to see his colleagues, unable to know whether anyone beyond the creek knew he existed. He was kept alive as a source of abuse rather than a prisoner of value. He survived. He kept surviving. But the men planning his rescue couldn't know that with certainty, which is part of why the plan that eventually took shape had to move quickly. Negotiations began on 27th August, 2 days after the capture. Lieutenant Colonel Simon Fordham, commanding officer of the Royal Irish Regiment, led the British side with support from hostage negotiators from the Metropolitan Police. The Westside Boys wouldn't allow the negotiating team any closer to Magbeni than the end of the track from the main road. Fordham met there with Calais, who insisted on being addressed by the rank of brigadier, a rank he had awarded himself, though he had been a sergeant in the Sierra Leone army before the Civil War dissolved all institutional authority. The meetings were tense, erratic, and frequently derailed. The Westside Boys were heavy users of cocaine, heroin, and locally produced palm wine. Their drug consumption caused them to forget previous discussions. The cocaine made them paranoid, suspicious of conclusions they had themselves reached the day before. Every meeting started approximately from scratch. On August 29th, Fordham demanded proof that the remaining soldiers were still alive. Calais agreed and brought two of the captive officers to the meeting, Major Marshall and Captain John Laverty. Under guard, before armed men, in front of Calais himself, Laverty shook hands with Fordham. In that handshake, he passed a folded piece of paper, a sketch map of Gaberibana he had drawn from memory during his captivity. It showed the compound layout, the buildings, their functions, the structure where the hostages were held, the guard positions he had been able to observe from inside. He had no guarantee it would reach the right hands. He drew it anyway and passed it in a handshake because it was the only thing available to him. That piece of paper became a primary intelligence document for British assault planners. 2 days later, on August 31st, 5 soldiers were released in exchange for a satellite telephone and medical supplies. The sergeant major, 2 corporals and 2 rangers returned to base at Benguema, 25 miles from Freetown. They were debriefed immediately. Compound layout, guard patterns, schedules, the condition of the men still inside, what Bangura's situation appeared to be from what little they could observe. 6 days of captivity had produced a detailed and specific intelligence picture that was fed directly into a planning process already running in parallel with the negotiations. The satellite telephone had a second value. Calais used it almost immediately to call the BBC for a lengthy interview outlining his demands. The broadcast lasted long enough for specialists from the Royal Corps of Signals to determine the precise location of the handset from signal interception. The concession the British had offered as a goodwill gesture had become a targeting asset. After the partial release, the demands escalated steadily. By September 9th, 16 days into the crisis, Calais' spokesman announced the remaining hostages wouldn't be released until a new Sierra Leone government was formed. That wasn't a negotiating position. British planners had been building something else since the first week of September. The question was no longer whether to act. It was whether the plan was large enough to work. To understand why the plan needed to be as large as it was, you need to understand what British soldiers were doing in Sierra Leone in the first place. The Sierra Leonean Civil War had been running since 1991. The Revolutionary United Front, the RUF, launched its insurgency from the east, financed by diamond smuggling, and built a reputation for systematic mass atrocities that became internationally notorious. Villages burned, hands amputated to terrorize populations into submission, children conscripted at gunpoint and forced to kill their own relatives before being handed weapons. By 2000, roughly 2 million people, close to a third of the population, had been displaced. The UN's peacekeeping mission, UNAMSIL, was established in October 1999 with an authorized strength initially set at 6,000 troops. In May 2000, the RUF took approximately 500 UNAMSIL peacekeepers hostage. The mission's credibility collapsed. Foreign diplomats estimated the RUF could reach Freetown within a week if nothing intervened. Britain intervened. Brigadier David Richards and a reconnaissance team arrived on the 6th of May 2000 under Operation Palliser, formally authorized as a non-combatant evacuation operation. It expanded almost immediately. Paratroopers from one para secured Lungi Airport. British forces pushed the RUF back from the capital's outskirts. The RUF's leader, Fode Sanko, was captured by Sierra Leonean forces on May 17th. By June, a short-term training team had replaced the initial force, tasked with rebuilding the Sierra Leone army. The Royal Irish took over that training mission in July. The political context behind all of this was explicit. Tony Blair's Doctrine of the International Community, delivered in Chicago in April 1999, argued for humanitarian military intervention in states that had collapsed and were conducting mass atrocities against their own populations. Sierra Leone was the clearest available test of that doctrine. The British armed forces weren't as globally stretched in 2000 as they would be within 3 years. Afghanistan was 14 months away. And senior officers had told Blair that an operation in Sierra Leone was feasible. Palliser and the training mission that followed were working. The Westside Boys were the thing that had been allowed to fester while the bigger fights commanded attention. When they ambushed the Royal Irish Patrol in August, they created a crisis that couldn't continue. Failure to resolve it would likely have forced Britain to withdraw all its forces from the country. The credibility of the entire intervention, and through it, Blair's framework for humanitarian force, was sitting in a hut in Berry Bana. The Westside Boys were neither random criminals nor coherent insurgents. They were something specifically difficult to deal with. Former soldiers with no political logic, no realistic demands, and no functional fear of consequences. The group had emerged from the wreckage of the Sierra Leone army after the 1997 coup by Major Johnny Paul Koroma. Most members were former AFRC fighters, the Armed Forces Revolutionary Council, who had been on the losing side of the post-coup settlement. After the Lome Peace Accord of July 1999, there were paths out of the conflict for the RUF and for demobilized SLA soldiers. The Westside Boys chose none of them. They refused integration into the reconstituted Sierra Leone army and occupied the abandoned villages of Gberibana and Magbeni on opposite banks of Rokel Creek, operating as armed bandits controlling that stretch of road and river. Calais had been a sergeant. He was approximately 24 years old in September 2000 and had awarded himself the rank of brigadier. His second-in-command called himself Colonel Cambodia. Other subordinates used Colonel Savage and Colonel Terminator as their operating names. The ranks were invented. The command structure ran on Calais' personal authority over men who were heavily armed, frequently intoxicated, and prone to turning violence inward. He had executed members of his own group before. Their drug consumption wasn't occasional, it was operational. Cocaine, heroin, and palm wine moved through both camps daily. A fighter's disposition could reverse in minutes, depending on what he had consumed in the last hour. British negotiators experienced this directly. The cocaine produced paranoia, causing the Westside Boys to become suspicious of agreements they had personally made the previous day. In conversations they could no longer accurately recall. Fordham's team wasn't making slow progress. They were making no progress. Across a series of meetings that the Westside Boys experienced as entirely unconnected. Their weapons compounded everything. The Westside Boys were equipped with AK pattern rifles, RPG-7 rocket launchers, mortars, and ZPU-2 twin-barreled 14.5mm anti-aircraft guns mounted on vehicles. A ZPU-2 isn't a personal weapon. It's a system designed to destroy aircraft, capable of firing up to 600 rounds per minute of heavy armor-piercing ammunition. The Westside Boys had those guns positioned at Magbeni, covering the approaches to both villages. Any assault by helicopter, and there was no viable overland approach through dense jungle and mangrove swamp, had to neutralize those weapons in the first seconds of the attack. The two-compound geography created the problem that no amount of Special Forces excellence could solve alone. Berry Barna on the north bank, Calais' headquarters, the hostages. Magbeni on the south bank, a larger camp, more fighters, heavier weapons. The creek between them was approximately 275 meters wide. 200 to 300 fighters were distributed across both locations. If Berry Barna was hit first, the fighters at Magbeni could cross the creek, reinforce the defense, or reach the hostages before extraction was complete. Both locations had to be struck simultaneously. That constraint shaped everything that followed. The intelligence picture that made a plan possible was assembled over several weeks, using methods that required patience, endurance, and silence in roughly equal measure. Captain Laverty's sketch map, passed on August 29th, established the internal layout of Berry Barna. Debriefs of the 5 released soldiers added pattern-of-life detail, guard change timings, the behavior of specific commanders, the condition of the men still inside. Signals intelligence from Calais' satellite telephone had confirmed his precise location. What that intelligence couldn't provide was a living picture of how the camps operated hour by hour, where specific weapons were at specific times, how alert the fighters were at dawn versus midday, where the gaps in the perimeter were. That required human eyes inside the Westside Boys' observation range, around the clock, for multiple days. 2 SAS observation teams were inserted to provide exactly that. Designated SGA covering Berry Barna and SGB covering Magbeni, they were delivered at night by inflatable raiding craft, navigated up the tributary channels of Rokel Creek by SBS coxswains. The boats moved in darkness, in silence, at the critical final approach, paddled by men who knew that a splash, an engine sound, or a shifted piece of equipment scraping the hull could carry across water to an armed camp 30 meters from the riverbank. The teams established concealed positions in dense jungle, within acoustic and visual range of both villages. And then they waited. For days. Military personnel call it hard routine. No movement unless essential, no noise, no fire, no light. Rations eaten cold when eaten at all. In West African jungle in late August, the insect life does not distinguish between the observer and the observed. Mosquitoes, biting ants, the ambient chorus of the rainforest at night. None of it stops, and none of it can be acknowledged. The heat during the day is compressive and sustained. At night, it drops enough to make the moisture from the surrounding vegetation uncomfortable in a different way. Rain arrives without warning and changes nothing for the better. Through their optics and parabolic microphones, capable of picking up conversation at distance, the teams built a complete daily rhythm of both camps. Guard changeovers at Berry Barna, noted and timed. The location and daily handling of the ZPU-2 at Magbeni, which fighters operated it, when it was manned, when it wasn't. The movement of Calais himself between buildings. The times when the camps fell quiet. That last piece of intelligence may have been the most operationally significant. What the teams established across days of observation was that dawn was when the Westside Boys were at their lowest alertness. The drugs and alcohol that sustained the camp's culture created fighters who were difficult to rouse in the early morning. The camps were quieter then, the guards slower, the compound not yet in whatever state the day's consumption would produce by mid-morning. Dawn was when the mission would go. The teams also confirmed viable helicopter landing zones near both villages. Critical information because the Chinooks couldn't hover indefinitely over armed positions while assault forces worked out where to put down. The zones were marked, the distances measured, the approach paths mapped. The observation teams had been invisible to the Westside Boys for days. On the morning of the assault, they would transition instantly from surveillance to direct fire support. The first shots fired at both objectives before the Chinooks had completed their descent. Meanwhile, 2 SAS operators had embedded themselves in Fordham's negotiating team. One attended multiple meetings with the Westside Boys, posing as a Royal Irish major, gaining access to the compound perimeter and direct observation of Calais and his immediate command structure across several sessions. What they learned about his decision-making patterns, his bodyguard positioning, and the layout of the meeting ground added a dimension to the intelligence picture that no technical collection could replicate. The picture was still incomplete. The precise number of fighters in the compounds varied day to day. The exact positioning of Magbeni's mortar crews remained uncertain. The scale of the resistance A Company would encounter when it hit the south bank was an estimate rather than a certainty. The intelligence was good enough to build a plan on. It wasn't good enough to guarantee the plan would survive contact with the enemy intact. The plan, when finalized, required approximately 272 people. Special forces alone were insufficient. The two-objective problem, with a 275-metre river running through it, made that conclusion unavoidable. As British planners assessed the situation, the operational logic was simple. If you send special forces at Barras without simultaneously addressing Magbeni, you are conducting a hostage rescue while 200 armed fighters on the far bank decide what to do. That wasn't an acceptable risk environment for a hostage rescue. D Squadron, 22 SAS, reinforced by a troop from C Squadron, Special Boat Service, would assault Barras. Precision, speed, and the extraction of 7 specific individuals. The SGA observation team would provide direct fire support from the tree line the moment the Chinooks began their approach, guiding assault teams toward the objective building. The same building Laverty's sketch map had identified, that the released soldiers had confirmed, that the observation teams had watched for a week. A Company, 1st Battalion Parachute Regiment, led by Major Matthew Lowe, would assault Magbeni from the south simultaneously. Their objectives were formally specified: neutralize the weapons at Magbeni that could disrupt the SAS operation, fix the Magbeni fighters in position and prevent them crossing Roquel Creek, defeat the Westside Boys and destroy their military capability, recover the Royal Irish's 3 seized Land Rovers. A Company was enhanced with a signals group, snipers, heavy machine gun sections, and a mortar section from elsewhere in the battalion. Some members of A Company had completed basic training 2 weeks earlier. Lowe decided against replacing them. Pulling in unfamiliar soldiers would disrupt the company cohesion that a contested assault requires. The newer men would go in alongside veterans from Palliser who already knew the country and the climate. To manage the tropical heat, commanders stripped the load to essentials: weapons, ammunition, water, and field dressings. Nothing else. On the 3rd of September, the company was moved to South Cherney in Gloucestershire under the cover story of a readiness to move exercise. Mobile phones were confiscated. Only at that point was the full company told what was actually being planned. An SAS planning group flew to Dakar, Senegal, to study the accumulated intelligence and develop detailed assault plans. A Company followed into theatre. The move reduced the emergency response time from 14 hours, if launched from Britain, to a window that could actually support the operation. By early September, the assault force had established itself at Hastings Airfield, 30 miles south of Freetown. There, a scale replica of Magbeni had been constructed from the observation team's accumulated intelligence and the Lavity sketch map. Actual dimensions, the specific buildings, the distances between them, the direction of the creek. Each platoon drilled its assigned objectives until the layout was reflexive, until every soldier could find his door in darkness without having to think about it. Because in a contested village assault under fire, thinking about the map is too slow. The helicopter package was built around the ZPU-2 threat. 3 Chinook HC-2 heavy-lift helicopters from 7 Squadron RAF's Special Forces Flight would insert D Squadron at Gaberi Bana and A Company at Magbeni. 2 Lynx Mark 7 attack helicopters from 657 Squadron Army Air Corps, armed with M134 miniguns capable of firing thousands of rounds per minute, would provide direct fire support during the insertion phase. Their primary target at the moment the assault began was the ZPU-2 gun position at Magbeni, the one weapon that, if it came to full effect against hovering Chinooks, could end the operation before the assault forces were on the ground. A Me-24 Hind gunship, operated by Allied local forces, would suppress the broader approach corridors. Political authority to launch in an emergency was delegated to British High Commissioner Alan Jones in Freetown. Military decision authority rested with Brigadier David Richards, the same officer who had led the original Palliser reconnaissance team in May. On September 9th, final authorizations were obtained from Sierra Leonean President Kabar and from Tony Blair. The mission was confirmed for dawn on September 10th. The task force departed Hastings at approximately 6:15. Flying time to the target area, roughly 15 minutes. The Chinooks flew low along Rokal Creek, using the river as their approach corridor, placing the water between themselves and the camps for as long as possible. Downstream, out of visual and acoustic range, they had been holding in a pattern, waiting for the observation teams at both villages to signal that they were in position, that the camps were at their expected level of dawn quietness, and that the morning's conditions matched the plan. The signal came. The formation turned and began moving upriver, the trees on both banks sliding past in the grey light of first dawn. 15 minutes isn't long enough for doubt to become conversation, but it's long enough to feel every contingency in the plan. The Lynx attack helicopters moved ahead of the formation, dropping lower as the villages came within range. At Magbeni, the ZPU-2 was the first priority. The 657 Squadron crews identified the gun position, the same position the SGB observation team had watched for days, and strafed it in the opening seconds of the assault, before the Westside Boys on the ground had fully processed what was happening. The gun never came to full effect against the approaching Chinooks. That outcome, achieved in the first few seconds of contact, was the result of days of observation, precise target identification, and a gun crew that knew exactly where to point before they were within range of return fire. At Berry Bana, simultaneously, the SGA observation team opened fire from the jungle tree line, engaging the nearest armed fighters while the Chinooks completed their approach. The downdraft from the helicopters as they came in low was immense, strong enough to tear corrugated tin roofs from the huts in the compound, including, reportedly, from the building where the hostages were held. The Westside Boys in Berry Bana heard the helicopters. They had seconds. Then they opened fire. D Squadron fast roped into the compound under incoming rounds. This is what makes the approach phase of a helicopter assault so exposed. The aircraft must hover, stationary, while men descend a rope hand over hand, and the ground below isn't yet controlled. The observation team from SGA was working from the tree line, providing fire and directing the assault teams toward the objective building. The building that Laverty's sketch map had marked, that the released soldiers had confirmed, that SGA had watched from 50 meters of jungle for a week. The assault moved through the compound quickly, under fire in the early morning light. Early in the engagement, in the opening minutes, a round struck Bombardier Bradley Tinian. He had come to D Squadron from the Royal Artillery, which is why his rank was Bombardier rather than Trooper. SAS soldiers keep the rank from their parent regiment. He was 27 years old. Published accounts of the operation note that Barras was his first deployment with the regiment. He had passed selection, completed continuation training, and done everything required to serve in D Squadron. He was shot in the chest. His comrades pulled him from the firefight and got him to a helicopter. He was evacuated to HMS Argyll. He died of his wounds. The assault at Geberibana continued. The hostages had been waiting in their building for 16 days. They had listened to negotiations going nowhere. They had watched the guards and counted the hours and measured what little they could observe of the compound's routines. When the helicopters came in and the firing started and the roofs began tearing away, they knew what it had to mean. They made themselves heard above the gunfire. They shouted, "British Army! British Army!" The assault teams followed the voices to the building. 6 soldiers emerged alive. Finding Lieutenant Musa Bangura took longer. He wasn't with the British soldiers. Searchers moved through the compound, searching for the 7th person. They found him in the pit, alive, but beaten and starved across 16 days, unable to stand unassisted. He was lifted out and carried to the extraction point. In under 20 minutes from the first SAS troops landing at Beribana, all 7 hostages were being lifted away. Fode Calais was taken alive. Across Rockall Creek, A Company was in harder contact than anyone had fully prepared for. The 3rd Chinook came in over Magbeni's designated landing zone. The Barras jumped from the tail ramp. The observation team had warned the ground was wet. They landed in waist-deep swamp, worse, significantly worse than the pre-assault intelligence had indicated. The water came up to their waists. The weight of their weapons and equipment pulled at them. They moved through it as fast as men can move through waist-deep water in semi-darkness, toward the tree line, toward any solid ground. They weren't moving quickly. They were visible and loud, and the village was ahead of them. They reached the tree line and began to reorganize. A mortar round came in. The explosion hit the leading elements of the company in the opening moments of the assault, wounding Major Lowe and several key personnel, members of the command group, before A Company had properly engaged the objective. The company commander was down. A signaller transmitted a casualty report. One of the Chinooks, completing its run at Geberibana, diverted to a track near Magbeni and landed to evacuate the wounded. The company's second-in-command assumed command without ceremony. A Company kept moving. The Westside Boys in Magbeni were in prepared positions. They had medium machine guns, fighters in hardened buildings, and the aggression that their drug use conferred, the absence of physical fear that cocaine and heroin produce. The willingness to stand and fight past the point where sober calculation would produce retreat. They engaged from inside the village's structures and from the approaches on the far side.
The 657 Squadron Lynx were overhead, suppressing targets and providing cover as the Barras came out of the swamp and pushed into the village. The Barras moved through Magbeni according to the rehearsed plan. Every platoon knew its assignment. Every soldier had walked the scale replica at Hastings enough times that the distances between buildings were in his hands rather than his memory. In a contested assault, that kind of preparation functions like a reflex. The body has already done it, and the brain does not have to retrieve the map during the part when the map is hardest to think about. The fighting was sustained. The Westside Boys resisted, building by building, room by room, for the better part of 2 hours. By 8 o'clock, Magbeni was secure. By 8 o'clock, 12 Barras had been wounded. The Barras recovered the 3 Royal Irish Land Rovers. They secured the Westside Boys' ammunition store. They laid claymore mines in the approaches against the possibility of fighters returning from the jungle. Patrols pushed into the surrounding tree line, looking for those who had fled the initial assault. The last Barras were extracted at 1400, 8 hours after the force had lifted off from Hastings. 21 Sierra Leonean civilians held captive at both compounds were freed. Men and women seized from the road over months of banditry, held as servants and labourers, and worse. One of them, a man named Brema Foba, attempted to flee during the firefight and was fatally wounded in the crossfire. He wasn't a combatant. He was a prisoner, trying to escape what may have looked to him like another attack on the village. His death is the only civilian fatality attributed to British military action across the entire Sierra Leone intervention, and it appears in almost none of the popular accounts of the operation. British casualties: 1 killed, Bombardier Tinian, and 12 wounded, 1 seriously. At least 25 Westside Boys died across both objectives. 18 were captured, including Calais. Within 2 weeks, more than 300 Westside Boys had surrendered to UNAMSIL. Calais was put in front of a microphone and recorded calling on his remaining fighters to give themselves up. The group never reconstituted as a military force. The Times published its first detailed account the following morning, citing Ministry of Defence sources. Total service personnel involved, 272. The MOD initially declined to confirm Special Forces involvement and avoided identifying Tinian's unit, standard operational security that lasted long enough for early press coverage to misidentify the casualties as paratroopers. Subsequent published accounts and the formal record established correctly that Bombardier Tinian was 22 SAS. That protective discretion, reasonable in operational terms, is also part of how the simplified version calcified. When the official line is silence about force composition, the public story defaults to the most legible unit. The SAS rescued British soldiers in Sierra Leone. Technically accurate, structurally incomplete. The political consequences were immediate and consequential in specific ways. Barras holds a distinction rarely acknowledged in the popular narrative. It was the first direct attack by any force on a rebel position during Sierra Leone's entire 9-year civil war. A decade of conflict in which multilateral peacekeeping had consistently failed to act decisively until a bilateral British force moved unilaterally. That distinction mattered in the country's context. The operation validated 6 months of British military commitment in Sierra Leone and, in the assessment of scholars who have studied the intervention closely, prevented a withdrawal that would have been politically unavoidable if the rescue had failed or gone badly. For Blair, the operation confirmed the Chicago Doctrine in practice. A precisely applied expeditionary force had shifted a failing state's trajectory. British training teams remained in Sierra Leone after September 2000. The RUF was progressively disarmed under renewed international pressure and economic sanctions on Liberia, which had sustained the RUF in exchange for conflict diamonds. The Special Court for Sierra Leone eventually tried the war's leaders. Fode Sanko died in custody in July 2003. Fode Calais was handed to the Sierra Leone police. The civil war was formally declared over by President Kabar on January 18, 2002. The confidence accruing from Palliser and Barras, a sequence that demonstrated Britain could intervene rapidly, stabilise a collapsing state, and extract its own people when required, informed the appetite for subsequent commitments. Academic analyses of British foreign policy in the early 2000s cite Sierra Leone explicitly as a precedent that shaped the confidence preceding Afghanistan in 2001 and Iraq in 2003. Whether those later operations validated that confidence or consumed it outside the scope of this story. What Barras established was simpler. Britain still had the machinery to do this kind of thing, and the machinery worked. That had not been guaranteed before September 9, 2000. The institutional consequences of the operation took concrete form in the years immediately following. In 2001, the Joint Special Forces Aviation Wing was established, a joint RAF and Army Air Corps organisation coordinating dedicated aviation support for UK Special Forces. The timing, 1 year after Barras demonstrated that helicopter capability wasn't a support option, but a load-bearing structural operations planning, wasn't coincidental. 7 Squadron and 657 Squadron had shown on September 10, 2000, what happens when aviation is designed into an operation from the beginning rather than allocated to it afterward. The JSFAW institutionalized that lesson. The Special Forces Support Group, established in 2006, is the more direct acknowledgement. Its creation is formally linked in official records to the Barras experience. The SFSG was built initially around one para, the same regiment that assaulted Magbeni, and its purpose is explicitly to act as a force multiplier for UK Special Forces on large or complex operations requiring more than a single squadron can provide. In other words, to do permanently what A Company had done on a specific morning in September 2000. Military academies have studied Barras as a model of planning and coordination between special forces and conventional units operating simultaneously against separate but interdependent objectives. The case is used to illustrate how aviation integration, human intelligence, special forces reconnaissance, and airborne infantry can function as one system rather than 4 separate capabilities operating in proximity. The operation is placed in contrast to Operation Eagle Claw, the 1980 American attempt to rescue 52 hostages from Iran, which collapsed in a desert before reaching the objective, killing 8 US servicemen in a rotary wing collision caused by insufficient aircraft, poor integration between crews and ground forces, and a mission architecture that had no margin for failure. Barras succeeded partly because the aviation component was sized not around what was available, but around what the mission actually required. The lesson, encoded in both the JSFAW and the SFSG, is the same lesson the planning group drew in early September 2000, looking at a map with a river running through it and 2 armed compounds on opposite banks. Special forces are exceptionally capable. They aren't capable of being everywhere at once. When the tactical problem demands 2 objectives simultaneously, and one of those objectives takes a company of trained infantry to clear, You don't find a better SAS squadron. You build a system that provides the complete capability the problem demands. Major Marshall received a formal reprimand for the unauthorized detour that started the crisis. No court-martial was convened. The inquiry found an error of professional judgment rather than a breach of military law. But the finding was recorded on his service file. Brigadier David Richards, to whom military authority for the Barras assault was delegated, eventually rose to become Chief of the Defence Staff in 2010.
The career trajectory of the officer who oversaw Operation Barras ended at the top of the British military. Bombardier Bradley Tinian was 27 years old. He had come to D Squadron from the Royal Artillery. He had passed selection, completed the continuation training, and done everything required to earn his place. Barras was his first deployment with the regiment. He died in the first minutes of the first time he was called on to do it for real. His name is on the Clock Tower Memorial at the SAS barracks in Hereford. The operation he died in wasn't a failure. It wasn't clean either, and the version of it most commonly told leaves things out. The Barras landed in swamp deeper than anyone had told them to expect. The company commander went down in the opening exchange. 12 men came home wounded. A civilian named Brimer Foba tried to flee in the wrong direction and was killed in the crossfire. These are the edges of a successful operation. Not evidence of failure, but evidence of what success actually costs, and why it required 272 people, 3 weeks of preparation, a covertly passed sketch map, days of men lying motionless in West African jungle without making a sound, and every component of the British Special Operations System synchronized over the same creek at the same moment. Operation Barras is remembered as a rescue. It was also a test of whether Britain could still think quickly, move precisely, and use force decisively when negotiation ran out of road. The hostages came home because the plan worked. The plan worked because it was bigger than the myth of it. D Squadron fast-roped into Gaberibana, knowing that A Company 1 Para was hitting the other bank at the same instant, that Lynx helicopters from 657 Squadron were suppressing the ZPU-2 position that would otherwise have tracked the Chinooks, and that SAS observation teams who had spent days in the jungle watching the compound were already in action from the tree line, guiding assault teams toward the building. Remove any one of those elements and the mission changes entirely. Remove the parachute regiment, D Squadron conducts a hostage rescue while 200 fighters on the opposite bank of a 275-metre river make decisions in real time. Remove the SBS. The observation teams never get inserted at night, and British planners approach the assault with substantially thinner intelligence. Remove 657 Squadron's Lynx. The ZPU-2 at Magbeni is operational when the Chinooks begin their descent. Remove 7 Squadron's Chinooks. There is no air assault at all. Not the SAS alone, not the Barras alone. Not any single element acting in isolation. A whole system moved at once. On one morning in September 2000, over a creek in the Ochra Hills east of Freetown, it moved just fast enough. Subscribe for more stories like this.